I'd like to welcome you and our speaker, Dr. Daniel Cervone, Professor of Psychology from the University of Illinois at Chicago. It's quite a privilege for us to have him speak about this book. Those of you who are in psychology will know the name Albert Bandura and the contribution he's made over many decades, and I can't wait to hear about what's inside of it. I'd now like to read some introductory remarks sent to us by Mary Bandura. Years ago, when my father was approaching normal retirement age, people would sometimes ask me when I thought he would retire. I'd say, he'll never retire. He may stop teaching, but he'll go to his grave writing about psychology. While I was joking about this, I was right. He started this book at age 91 and was still working on it when he died at age 94. It is a fitting final book. My father said he wanted to mirror his 1977 book, Social Learning Theory, in which he presented a concise overview of developments in social learning. Most of his previous writings were dense tomes, geared towards an academic audience. In this work, he set out to present the theoretical foundations of social cognitive theory in a more concise, more accessible format. He intended it to span the arc of his career, outlining both his theory of human nature and the way it's been applied for human betterment. He fondly referred to it as his farewell book, and hoping to pass on a blueprint for future developments in psychology. Enter Dr. Daniel Cervone, a former student of my father's. Dan was an obvious choice to complete this book. He has a deep understanding of the conceptual foundations of social cognitive theory and has made significant contributions to their development. He is a terrific writer and devised a way to finish the book that preserved my father's voice while skillfully weaving the narrative together. I know my father would be delighted with the result. I thank him for this gift to my father and to the field, and I thank Wiley & Sons for publishing the book. I leave it to Dan and Dr. Ritchie to flesh out social cognitive theory for you today and to bring the central features to life. I'll end by saying that while my father's work seems complex, it is grounded in real-world human experiences we can all relate to. It is a theory that emphasizes personal responsibility and ways to exercise control over the course of one's life. It fosters optimism and empowerment. I leave you with my father's signature sign-off. May the efficacy force be with you.
Well, thank you. A whole bunch of people, obviously to Professor Ritchie, but also to Wiley for doing this project, providing some support here, to you for coming. I have to say, I'm not doing anything that resembles some stock talk I would do in a class or in any psychology setting, because, of course, I was guessing that lots of people here were not in psychology. So I'm going to open rather hesitantly by saying what I'm doing and not doing. My reference is, I don't know how well known this is, in what they call intellectual circles in the United States, if that's not an oxymoron. The fish who says that is relatively well known because it comes from one of the two or three most well-known commencement addresses. I don't know if that's a common thing here in U.S. Colleges and universities fight over finding the most well-known speaker to show up on graduation day and give a commencement address. And it's very hard for the poor speaker who has roughly 15 minutes and a distracted audience and has no time to make more than one point. And it's very difficult to land at any points more than zero. The fish asking what is water comes from a commencement address at Kenyon College in Ohio by, unfortunately, the late author David Foster Wallace. He uses the fish for a slightly different reason than I did. He uses the fish because someone wants to know what it's like to live underwater and goes underwater and asks the fish, who responds. Because, of course, the fish is just taken for granted the routines of life, hasn't processed them, and is giving no thoughts to water. Wallace's point is to get people to think about the routines, think beyond the routines, control what they attend to and think about. Frankly, Wallace's point is that the point of Dr. Ritchie's most recent book, My point is slightly different. Sometimes one can be so close to something, have such expertise in it, that one might not be the best source of information for all audiences. Before this talk, it struck me that someone could ask any of us, what's our smartphone like? How do we like having it? And we would answer by saying, oh, we just upgraded to, iPhone 14, and now we have 3 lenses on the back, and now we can click here to take a picture. But if the person was from a different culture, they meant, what's it like to have a communications device in your pocket? I'm so close to the work of Albert Bandura that I may be giving answers on the order of, oh, it's got 3 lenses on the back, whereas the question I should be addressing is analogous to what's it like to have a communications device in your pocket. So fortunately, it's a question and answer session, and I'm imagining that not too terribly long from now, we'll turn over to the question and answer session, which will be the opportunity to actually ask the questions that I should have been answering here in the first 20 or so minutes of the presentation. So I will say a couple things, 2 things that I won't be doing. I'm not going to provide the information that's in a Wikipedia article about this psychologist. You easily can punch up the Wikipedia article, thank heavens no one's doing it right now, and find out that he was born in some small town in northern Canada and lived in a 1-room schoolhouse and on. To my knowledge, at least for what's public, none of that is particularly consequential to the development of his ideas, and you can just look that up. I'm also not going to say, here are the 14 points that are most important in the book, hierarchically ordered, both because one can't do justice to that quickly, and because if you're not in psychology, why you would make those points would actually not be terribly consequential, as with any slightly technical book. So I'm going to address other questions, and I hopefully have worked, as if one is interested in the intellectual life of the late 20th and early 21st century, and the psychologist happens to have a place in it. So I'm going to give a particular kind of answer to the question, Albert Bandura, who was he? That's the Albert Bandura on the left, is from the Stanford University archives photos, and I would guess is still in the late 1950s. I just happen to have seen it, never even seen this before until a week or 2 ago. And the one on the right is out of stock at Etsy. But for some period of time, they had some kind of small doll. I couldn't find a bobblehead doll. They had that for most figures in the United States, but you could get that. But here's the simple way to say who Albert Bandura was that makes it reasonable that we're having an event to say something about Albert Bandura is through the admittedly simplistic tool of ranking. Yes, everything gets ranked. Best ranking formulas, however, this one's from the United Kingdom, so it must be good. Times Higher Education in March 2007. Don't know why it took them so long to publish. But I guess a lot of computations back then. Reported the most highly cited authors in, note, the humanities. So we're using our usual breakdown of subfields and calling something sciences, social sciences, and humanities. The first 3 people are Foucault, Bourdieu, and Derrida. That's not surprising. Even I would have guessed conceivably that those 2. The surprise is that the most high, and note, he's still alive. The most highly cited living author in the humanities was an experimental psychologist. The other characters you would expect, like Habermas and Weber, show up, and, Kant is down there pulling up the others, Wittgenstein, they show up, Freud's here sooner or later. But oddly, something that a century from now, people have looked back at things like this. Oddly, in the intellectual life of the early 20th century, the most highly cited living author in the humanities was somebody who ran psychology experiments. So if there's a general question, it's in essence, how did that happen? In other words, what was this person doing that he's on a list of most highly cited figures essentially in discourse about human affairs while having a life of, I'll say what I mean by this, a regular psychology faculty member. This is not someone who founded an institute such that there were 50 people doing research of his sort. He didn't found his own journals. The most highly cited British psychologist in history, Hans Eysenck, had so many of his students that he created a journal, published research which was a reasonable thing to do. Bandura did none of those things. He had a regular life. He'd show up in his office, he's teaching the class, he's writing a paper, and somehow he's on this, what in American style I'm calling mega-cited scholars list. There's a couple different answers to this. One involves two extraordinarily high impact research findings and associated ideas. If you ever took, even if it was a while back, you took introductory psychology, I suspect both of them will ring a bell, and then if you're in psychology, they're so well known that you wonder why I'm putting them up. One of them, the first one that was well known, was the study of psychological modeling, or what became known as observational learning, or what really became known as the Bobo doll study. So this is probably in the academic year 60, 61, at a nursery school that is on campus at Stanford University, which is quite convenient. I suspect the reason for putting the nursery school on campus was so that faculty and staff with small children could drop off their children at the nursery school. Though the way the history of psychology went, it almost looks like the psychology department asked them to put it there to run experiments. Two of the most well-known studies in the history of psychology, this and something called the marshmallow test by the psychologist Walter Mischel, were both run in the same nursery school. I can hardly say if you've never, this is so well known, it's one of these handful of things everybody knows in psychology. Children during some break period in nursery school, they watch a film. The film shows an adult doing things like that, hitting a doll in the nose with a mallet. Then later in the day, in a different building, which I hadn't realized till reading this study 2 days ago, in a different building, children are in a room where there's a bunch of stuff they can play with, a tetherball hanging from a rope, one of those little ovens that kids play with, cars, trucks, dolls, and they measure amount of aggressive behavior. This is done over maybe a 15-minute period with every 20 seconds recordings of how many aggressive acts. And you almost don't have to put up the results, even though I will do that later. Very quickly, children learn the behaviors that they saw on film. This, in the year 2023, is not a surprise. But note, this extraordinarily simple demonstration had two impacts. One is to reconfigure every introductory psychology book in probably every language, because until 1962 or 3, every introductory psychology book had a chapter on learning and told you that there were two kinds of learning. The kinds where there's a Pavlovian dog who responds reflexively in response to a stimulus, and what became known as the B.F. Skinner-Skinnerian kind of learning, in which an animal seems to do something spontaneously rather than reflexively, as in the Pavlovian paradigm, but is really doing it as a function, the word Skinner used, of its past history of reward. So if occasionally it got rewarded for buying a lottery ticket, it continues to buy a lottery ticket, even if it doesn't win for a while, because that's the functional property of that scheduled reward. And that's how things went until Bandura published this thing, and everybody realized one of the largest oopses in probably the entire history of psychology. Oops, we kind of forgot something, because in Bandura's paradigm, there's no triggering stimuli, there's no rewards, there's no, this is why it's significant, there's no trials in which a person gradually learns something as a rat in a Skinner box gradually learns to do something complex. Children just do it all at once. It became immediately obvious that there was a gaping hole in the psychology of learning. And then the second thing is that maybe the word happens is correct. It happened to be the case that Bandura was doing this research at a time when, at least in the US, everybody had a TV. I believe TVs are in about 10% of American households in 1950 and 90% or more in 1960. And of course, American TV is showing people dressed as cowboys shooting each other, or men who are wrestlers throwing each other, or cartoons in which characters fall off a cliff and go splat. And Bandura begins to be asked to testify before Congress. In fact, I checked these news reports, and I'd always heard them, that they're not apocryphal, they're correct. It was actually, his testimony was so good before Congress that there was lobbying by television networks to stop Albert Bandura from testifying. Then that became public. Then there was more testimony, and this is old. This is by the 1970s. The United States Department of Justice recognizes that, oh, there's something to this thing. And in fact, children seem to be learning violence on TV. I don't know what happens here. In the US, there are now warning, for 15 years probably, there are warning labels. For example, if the show is violent, it tells you at the beginning of the show it's violent. I don't know if those would be there if Bandura hadn't run these studies on, maybe, but it's much of the, and I'll have a reference up later, of the study of the real-life impact of television violence is triggered by these early Bandura studies, and that topic is one of the 2 or 3 most well-known and understood in all of psychology. So that's a fairly big bang, and that's not even the most famous one. Oh, here's the data, sorry, then we'll go to the most famous one. In case you hadn't read this particular issue of the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin when it showed up in your mailbox in 2017, those are real effects. There's large-scale studies like this in which people will track. You have to track what program, for parents, what programs is your child watching, and then you get someone in communications who's separately coded the amount of violence in the show, and then you come back 5 years later or 10 years later, and you look at behavioral outcomes for children as a function of 10 variables, 9 of which are statistical controls, and 1 of which is amount of media violence, and if you do this in almost any country I've ever seen, media violence effect remains significant after controlling for all these other variables, and is similar to other risk factors. So exposure to a lot of TV violence and abusive parenting are both risk factors. That's a major, obviously high implication finding, and it's one of only 2. The other one is this. Bandura was trained as a therapist. I suspect he did not see any clients after becoming a faculty member and spent all his time being a researcher. But he was trained as a therapist, so he always had, I won't even say the back, not the forefront of his mind, not just the back, the therapeutic implications of the basic science. And what he realized, among other things from these modeling studies, is that not only were the children doing something, but they sometimes, as you can see from the girl on the bottom, seem to be quite into it emotionally. The emotional effect of modeling cues gradually caused Bandura to realize that one potentially effective way of reducing fears and anxiety, specifically fears that are in a situation, somebody who's afraid of small animals or agoraphobic and afraid of a particular location rather than like generalized anxiety disorder, is to develop therapies in which they experience some controlled success. A therapist goes with them, they succeed, and then step 2 of the thinking, maybe the reason that a client improves in that sort of therapy is not the Pavlovian dog reason of a reconditioning of the peripheral nervous system, but a change in a particular aspect of self-concept. Bandura publishes a paper with a simple title, Cognitive Processes Mediating Behavioral Change, that's the first self-efficacy paper, calls this particular variable perceived self-efficacy. By that he means Though it's not Bandura's language precisely, he really means that people will mentally simulate challenging situations, and when doing that, it's a natural thing to ask yourself, I wonder how it'll go if something goes wrong. I trip over the cord, I realize nobody has a background in psychology. And then it's this, I wonder how I can do in these challenging circumstances that are perceptions of self-efficacy. This originally was designed as a way to explain fear reduction in psychological therapy. Within a short amount of time, it becomes way more than that. And in the current literature, one can find book-length publications on self-efficacy in education, self-efficacy in sports, maximizing health. By that they mean physical health through self-efficacy. There's a huge literature in business and personnel psychology relating self-efficacy beliefs to success, for example, in leadership. There's a developmental literature, self-efficacy beliefs among adolescents who face a lot of life transitions as they move to high school and then in late adolescence consider college, and the sort of decisions people make are very much driven by a subjective sense of what I can do. And even on the lower right, somebody trying to teach people how to play cello, and chapter 3 of the cello book is on self-efficacy. So we've hit all corners of the intellectual globe. And this is a very real database. This is one of 50 kinds of references. This is a very large-scale database. There are these databases that always have acronyms whose names you can hardly remember. I always stands for international. So we know they're international. And S stands for students. And what they do is in large-scale databases internationally measure everything you could possibly be interested in. Learning styles, teacher behaviors, values, vocational interests, and almost inevitably, the strongest predictor of achievement is perceived self-efficacy. People don't think they're ever going to figure out how to do algebra. They kind of stop studying, they lose interest. What happens, and this is the details I'm kind of skipping, but what happens is a lot of other things that might be psychologically important, like, I'm interested in this, I'll work hard, I'm anxious about this, are one after another, at least partially driven by people's sense of how they can do, and so self-efficacy perceptions are a big winner. And that's two things. By that I mean Bandura has two separate contributions to psychology of very large magnitude. It's unusual to have that. I read once, it was a biography of the philosopher Wittgenstein, arguing that Wittgenstein had 3 contributions, and then arguing that there may be nobody else who had 3. Having 2 is quite unusual, and Bandura has 2, and they're of this magnitude. Right now you go online and just enter most famous experiments in psychology. One of them is a Bandura experiment, and if you look up classic articles, most cited articles in psychology, one of them is a Bandura paper, and they aren't the same topic. This is very unusual. It's even more, sorry for this detail, but since some of you are in psychology, even more unusual in this list, only one of the other papers is really a psychology paper. The rest are methods papers. You have to go back to the Stroop test, 1935, to find another actual psychology paper with research results that's equally cited. So that's one way of saying what happened. No one else in psychology has 2 things that are on these kind of household name ideas or findings. But I don't think that's exactly the best answer. The real answer is that psychology experienced a paradigm shift. And if you know psychology and you're less than probably 40 years old, you totally take it for granted and just can forget that there was a paradigm shift. But there was a genuine paradigm shift, and when I thought that to myself, when preparing this talk, I realized I should check. And so I did by doing Google Scholar searches, and I will put up a couple, and they will reveal the nature of this paradigm shift, which I think will become obvious from extremely simple bar graphs. The bar graphs look like this. I did Google Scholar searches for 2 periods of time, the 1950s ending in 60, and the first decade of this century, what do we call it, the zeros, ending in 2010. I did a title search, otherwise the numbers go wild, there's so many papers. So I did a title search in Google Scholar, and I did a correction. Of course, there's more papers now than there used to be, and so it's kind of trivial to say, oh, look, there's more now than there used to be, because there's just more of anything. You know, you just enter, you know, how many papers have the word the, there's more papers now. So I did the correction was to do a title search with the word psychology. There were roughly 4.6 times as many papers in the more recent decade with the word psychology in the title than the earlier decade, so I multiplied the earlier one by 4.6. For some topics, there's just a steady interest. There's a shift of maybe 5 or 10% of references. So if you look up personality and do the correction, people were studying personality back then, people were studying personality now. It's a small shift. If you look up psychotherapy as a title search, it's shifts of 10%, it's almost nothing. But now for these terms, social cognition in psychology refers to thinking about the social world, not memory for random words that were presented by an experimenter, but social thinking about the causes of other people's behavior, one's own sense of self, the causes of one's own behavior, stereotypes, etc., which of course is central to something called social cognitive theory. In the more recent decade, there are more than 2,500 papers with social and cognition, the 2 words in the title. Even with the correction, that's the 50s. Though cognition is a modern term, personality and self aren't. The notion of studying self and personalities in 2,500 papers in that decade in the title, and even with the correction, about 1/5 as many times in the 1950s. People set goals for themselves. They have personal goals. Hundreds of papers study that now, 1950s. Self and motivation. You think people motivate themselves through their thoughts about themselves, and self-concept plays a role in motivation. Everybody thinks that now, 2,500 papers, even with the correction. That's what the 50s were. A small number of papers, probably coming from the humanistic psychologists of the 50s who were quite ahead of their time, but of lesser impact. And then, in small print, it's an agentic perspective on human nature. Obviously, there's fewer papers that have the phrase personal agency in the title, because that would be a theory paper, not an empirical paper. Yet, in the decade of the first decade of this century, 140 plus papers have personal and agency in the title. In the 50s, that's 2 papers multiplied by 4.6. And the 2 papers are both in the Journal of Parapsychology. So nobody was studying real psychology. I mean, nobody was studying research-based psychology and personal agency in the 1950s. So that's what's really happened. Bandura didn't do this by himself. But in the forward to this, the one argument I, in a sense, make in the forward is that no one is more responsible for this paradigm shift. Not that this will save you some reading. The forward ends by essentially saying nobody is more responsible for this paradigm shift by Albert Bandura. At this point, a default conception of persons is that people have beliefs about themselves that influence their motivation and emotional state. People become depressed by thinking self-critically. They said, the standard grab bag of psychology did not exist in the 1950s. If it were not for Albert Bandura, it would still exist. There's intellectual trends, of course, it would still exist, but as suggested by those 2 papers that are unique in their citation, Bandura is probably more responsible for that intellectual shift than any other one person. I don't know why I said probably. The counter-argument would be, for those of you in psychology, sorry if you're not, there really were kind of 2 trends of cognitive, the study of mental processes in psychology. One of them in cognitive science associated with people like Noam Chomsky, who deserve a lot of credit for doing that too, and the other in studying whole persons in a social world and helping them in the concept of psychotherapy and change, where no one is equally influential to Bandura's. And that's, I think, why he has those bizarre citation numbers that were up at the beginning. This I'll do quickly. I think for those tracking this, there probably are three kinds of things that happen gradually. And if I said three, I should probably say 9, but if one wants to cite 3, one was this change in the notion of learning from animals in boxes to the study of social learning processes, and people learn from the social world. The other that I think is almost forgotten now by younger generations of clinical psychologists is that that's a quote from a famous cognitive behavioral therapist of the 1970s, Donald Meichenbaum, a Canadian psychologist, in which the probably still default approach to psychological therapy in a U.S. university, a cognitive behavioral approach, had as its training textbook Bandura's perhaps not ideally named Principles of Behavior Modification, written in the 1960s, and became the training Bible, so to speak, of the first generation of cognitive therapists. And then finally, by the late 1980s, Bandura puts together his thoughts and creates something that, despite this, is the newer book is the in a sense foundational book of Bandura's thinking, something called Social Foundations of Thought and Action, which I believe Mary Bandura called the dense tome. It's written very carefully. It's got a lot of references, but it's not easy to just pick up and read. And so what happened, frankly, is that Albert Bandura realized that at some point, 4 or 5 years before he passed away, realized that not too many people were going to read the 1986 dense tome, and it would cost you $240 to get it from purchase it from Amazon used or in the first place. And from 1986 to 2020, so many developments had occurred in his own thinking and research developments that it was time to put things together in one place again, precisely, of course, as Mary Bandura said, and that was the purpose of social cognitive theory. Its purpose was not to advance new ideas, but to take ideas circa 1980s to the present that sometimes were scattered and people not quite realizing how they hung together theoretically, and to put in one concise place the set of ideas that is social cognitive theory. So what I'm not going to do is to summarize those. How would we sell books if I did? But I will say something about what's distinctive about Bandura's work. There are, I think, oh good, this timing's working okay. There are, I think, 2 things that are, I'll summarize an idea from the book at the very end, but I think there are 2 things that are about Bandura's work that I haven't mentioned that are particularly distinctive. And I don't exactly see other people saying this, perhaps especially the first one. There's a particular research strategy that runs through Bandura's career, and oddly is not the primary way of conducting research, or at least not the most well-known way in psychology. 2 types of research strategies in psychology are so well known that, again, even if you're not in psychology, you probably are somewhat familiar with them. One is the social psychology experiment that generates a surprising result that you would never expect. What's being depicted is an actual picture from something called a bystander intervention experiment, where the effect is called the bystander effect. In this particular experiment, somebody is in a room filling out a survey, and smoke comes into the room. The measure is how long goes by before the person gets up and says, hey, there's smoke coming into the room. And the general finding is that if you put 4 other people in the room who just keep filling out the survey, then the who are confederates of the experimenter, they fill out the survey until they can't breathe. The 5th person takes longer. So, essentially there's a delay. If there's other people around, if you're out hiking and you pass by yourself and you pass somebody who's injured, you help them, and if you're walking down Michigan Avenue in Chicago and you pass by somebody who's lying on the ground and there's 500 people around, you walk past, so there's some counterintuitive effect in which people get less help when there's more people around. The other form of research, and it's surprising, the most famous example of this is the Milgram experiment, for example. The other strategy, which is by far the most common, is to get a whole bunch of people who used to have to sit in the room, and then somebody invented the internet, and now they don't even have to sit in the room. They fill out a survey, you measure something, and then you get some other measure, and you see if that something that you measured correlates with that other something. You literally just draw a Cartesian coordinate thing and correlate them. These research strategies are both limited. The subtle effect strategy has a scientific limitation, which is that you often don't know why the effect occurred. So if you know the Milgram experiment where people seemingly, they don't literally, shock to death a learner in another room, and then you ask, why did they do that? There's no obvious answer. You can spend a half hour discussing the multiple reasons why they did that. Also, some of these effects, and this has become well known in the last decade, don't replicate. Some of the well-known effects, for example, replicate just fine if you are in the United States of America, and they aren't cross-cultural effects. The limitations of strategy B are too numerous. Stating, obviously, science is supposed to see why something occurred. More formally, science seeks explanation, and if you just correlate two variables, you don't have grounds for explanation, and people are biased when they fill out surveys, and there's so many things that are wrong. But here's strategy C. The strategy C for Bandura was to run an experiment like A, but not to be doing it subtly. Bandura never sought out a surprising subtle effect. He essentially said, what's the most significant psychological process? How can we study that? Here's what happens if you do that. You get very robust results. In that first modeling study, the kids on the left saw the aggressive model. The bar graph in the middle saw a model who I think did puzzles or something non-aggressive. It's no question the experiment's going to replicate. It's like a tenfold effect. When Bandura did the research I already mentioned on these mastery therapies and perceived self-efficacy, here's the findings. Note, when the people are in the condition that's supposed to give them a high sense of self-efficacy, the top of the scale is 100, and they're pretty much there. Self-efficacy measures are supposed to predict behavior. Correlation is, if you know the statistics and psychology experiments, looks like it must be a typographical error. Correlations are supposed to be 0.24, or hooray, 0.31. Correlations 0.84. I'm just going to mention this, not just the name drop. I guess it's not name dropping if it's your own name, is it? But also to point out that there's more to Bandura psychology than this. It's an analysis of cognitively based motivation. That is how you get yourself out of bed and start working on things, and get yourself to keep working on the paper even though it's not due for 2 months. Then the analysis is only in part a self-efficacy analysis, and then it's part it's analysis of valuative reactions to the self. If you form a mental image and imagine yourself not having started this yet by the end of the day, and really just can't stand it or are highly dissatisfied with yourself, this reflection on self, evaluative reactions is seen as the driver. This is what I was doing in graduate school. Again, the experiment's going to replicate when you manipulate variables that are supposed to affect thinking. I'll spare you a lot of the details. A goal and feedback condition, rather than encouraging people to work hard, give people a specific numerical goal that dramatically increases the levels of motivation. If you then look at these thoughts about the self, especially in the bar graphs on the left, these aren't small effects. The group that has a high sense of self-efficacy and is dissatisfied with themselves is improving dramatically. The group with a low sense of self-efficacy, who's sort of given up caring in everyday language, is going in the opposite direction. So the Bandura research strategy over and over again generates really convincing, no problem of replication findings, in part because it's not relying on simple correlations, and in part because it's not trying for a simple, surprising, weird effect like locking people in a prison or the Milgram experiment. It's trying to isolate the major variables. Here's the subtle part, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. I like spending a lot of time on this, and it's very difficult to do it briefly. but I think it's probably the most important thing. In the fancy language of this, the question in psychology is the units of analysis used to discuss a person. By units of analysis, I mean I guess we don't really, that's going to take a dollar bill out of my pocket. It's just all credit cards now. But if you imagine back when there was a dollar bill, you could analyze its unit of analysis as a material substance like in a physics lab, or the unit of analysis is worth $1, socially constructed. But they're both correct, or lots of things could be analyzed with completely independent units of analysis. So if you go through the various theories of personality, there are different units of analysis. Many of them are quite interesting. Freud, for example, gave us a set of units of analysis that involve psychological systems with conflicting functions and different levels of consciousness of mind, which is an interesting idea, even if it's hard to align all of it with contemporary neuroscience. A lot of psychology has units of analysis like the ones on the left. Conscientiousness, grit, neuroticism. Bandura psychology has units of analysis like on the right. Personal goals, self-schemas, beliefs about the self, attention, memory. To Bandura, and I will certainly agree with them for anyone watching at home, to Bandura, these differences, box on the left and box on the right, are as different as terms like athleticism, physical attractiveness, proneness to illness and talent, as opposed to respiratory system, skeletal system, digestive system, blood pressure. There are many ways in which these terms differ. I find it hard to even summarize, because every time you start to summarize, there are 4 more points to make. One way to say it is this. In biology, individual persons each have a respiratory system, a skeletal system, blood that's under pressure, and a digestive system. It's not the case that you can go digging around the body and find the athleticism. There's also no one-to-one mapping. Somebody who's high in athleticism could be lifting a lot of weights, and somebody high in athleticism could be a figure skater or jumping upside down and backwards and landing without falling off on a balance beam. Needless to say, talent doesn't quite make sense unless you say for what. Similarly, the terms on the left remain among the most popular in psychology, with thousands of, as you've never seen grit, it's a conglomerate term of trying hardness or something. Neuroticism is feeling a bunch of negative emotions. These can't possibly be singular things, even though they were presented that way. It's completely impossible. Briefly, neuroticism includes both sadness in the classical definitions and tendency towards anger, which are active on different hemispheres of the brain. It can't be a thing. The only bit of technical stuff, this is not my work, that somebody has related these personality terms that are so common on the right to specific psychological tendencies on the left, like, I expect to fail. I'm able to do unpleasant tasks. I'm able to adapt to new situations. If the things on the right map to the things on the left, there would be one arrow from the left to the right, but instead if you draw the arrows, they're like that. It's just all mixed up. There is no psychology of the things on the right any more than there is a psychology of talent or a biological organism of athleticism. Bandura, the unusual feature for a psychology of persons, except it shouldn't seem unusual, but it is in 21st century psychology, is Bandura never posits or even cares about these general purpose personality terms like extroversion, conscientiousness, resilience, locus of control, neuroticism. I gave a talk recently where I tried to encapsulate that, and somebody said it, the way I did it was a good idea, so I'm doing it again. He doesn't care about it in the same way that your physician doesn't care about the trait of general healthiness. If you show up for your physician's annual appointment and your physician says, this year we're going to assess your general healthiness, and your physician gives you a questionnaire and asks you on average, do you feel healthy? The friends call you sickly, and then compute your score, and then compares your score to the general healthiness score of other people who previously have taken the test and then says, that's your physical checkup. You're a fourth of a standard deviation above the mean on general healthiness. You get a new physician. This isn't what happens. Your physician couldn't care less about general healthiness, and similarly, Bandura couldn't care less about these generic, context-free, compare people to one another, ranking individual difference constructs. They won't show up except to be criticized anywhere in Bandura's book. What Bandura does is to present a psychology of persons built on, as he sees it, personal determinants of action. Here's what's in the book. There are systems, psychological systems, that he sees as coherent, and I think it's defendable, in most, and their cognitive capacities to learn, to acquire knowledge, to reflect on yourself, to imagine futures, alternative futures, select them among them and set goals to achieve those, and it's not all cognitive, to react evaluatively to oneself, with pride, with dissatisfaction, with disgust at yourself that you're doing so badly. And inherently, these capacities are agentic. If there's something that's imperfect, sorry about the title, it's not really the case that Bandura has taken merely an agentic perspective on human nature, which is the term he used, which sounds almost arbitrary. He's almost, in a sense, derived an agentic psychology because people have a capacity for self-direction and agency unless literally everything he's ever done is completely wrong, because every aspect, including observational learning, since people can, especially with an internet and videos, select what they are going to learn in many cases if they have internet access, as some number of billions of people do. They're all agentic capacities. So that's what social cognitive theory is. It's research-based analysis of psychological capacities that inevitably yield and provide a research-based tool for capacities. The philosophers have long recognized that humans have a distinct, thanks to our species, whatever happened to us, a capacity for agency, and that's defining of human nature. And finally, nowadays, that seems intuitive and obvious. How could a person say anything else? I will simply end with the reminder that it's intuitive and obvious now, but when Bandura started, the only papers that said personal agency were in the Journal of Parapsychology. And so that's the Bandura effect.